good morning and welcome to the second day of the Symbiosis Literary Festival. It's a 2-day weekend, what I think is a bonanza for people sitting at home. Today we begin with another very interesting session. Before I hand over to Dr. Suchetna, who is going to take you through the morning's sessions, let me on a very personal note say that I'm absolutely delighted to have Ambassador Pawan Verma with us. Let me bluntly say I don't look at him as a SIU distinguished professor. I look at him as an SSLA distinguished professor, and I'm eternally grateful that he has mentored one of my young faculty members, Gayatri, to be what we want faculty to be, facilitators in conversations, linking the past with the present and the future. Welcome to this second day on behalf of the Chancellor of the University, the Pro-Chancellor and the Vice-Chancellor. Let me say your involvement and your commitment to spending some time with us is truly, truly appreciated. And I hope that these conversations matter and that they spill over when you have tea and coffee and meals, with your friends, and even serious debate and discussion. So welcome once again. Over to you, Dr. Sujay.
Thank you very much, Dr. Patil. Good morning to all of you, and welcome to the second day of Symbiosis Literary Festival. I was going to call on Dr. Patankar to give the welcome address, but it seems she's done her bit already. So I am not, I'm not going to follow that. Instead, we move on with our session. The first session of the day is around the book called The Great Hindu Civilization, authored by Ambassador Pawan Verma. We are delighted to have you with us, sir. Thank you very much. Professor Radhika Session will be in conversation with Ambassador Verma. Dr. Session is a historian who retired as a professor and head of the Department of History, Savitribai Phule, Pune University. Currently, she teaches at Symbiosis School for Liberal Arts. Her area of specialization is medieval Indian history, within which she's concentrated on economic history, especially maritime and urban history. She has authored 3 books: Trade and Politics on Coromandel Coast, Ideas and Institutions in Medieval India, 8th to 18th centuries, and The Constructions of the East in the Western Travel Narratives, 1300 to 1800. Needless to say that she has multiple publications in her kitty. May I request Professor to take over the session and begin by introducing Ambassador Verma.
Thank you very much, Dr. Suchetna and Dr. Anita, for inviting me in for this conversation. Mr. Verma, I'm going to be very provocative and very, very pointed, I think, in my queries, because the point of a conversation is to provoke replies. So I am going to be very, very provocative. Whether or not I believe in what I question you on is not the point. The point is I'm going to question you. So, let me begin, therefore, with the introduction. Let me start with the particular, that we are honored that, as Dr. Patankar has just said, it is a matter of great pride to us, Symbiosis, that he is an SIU distinguished professor. While this to us is of prime importance, I must point out that Ambassador Pawan Verma wears many hats. A writer-diplomat, he has been ambassador in several countries, including Bhutan, director of the Nehru Center in London, official spokesperson of the Ministry of External Affairs, Director General ICCR, and press secretary to the President of India. More recently, he has been an MP in the Rajya Sabha and earlier advisor to the Chief Minister of Bihar. Author of over a dozen best-selling books, including Ghalib the Man, The Times, Great Indian Middle Class. On a personal note, that's the one that I first read of yours, Ambassador Verma. The Book of Krishna, Being Indian, Becoming Indian, and Chanakya's New Manifesto. He was conferred an honorary doctoral degree for his contribution to the fields of diplomacy, literature, culture, and aesthetics by the University of Indianapolis in 2005. In 2018, he was conferred an honorary doctorate by the Sri Sharada Institute of Indian Management for his book, Adi Shankaracharya, Hinduism's Greatest Thinker. This book has also won the Attagalata Bengaluru Literature Festival Prize for the Best Book of Nonfiction for the year 2018. In 2012, he was conferred Bhutan's highest civilian award, the Druk Thukse, by His Majesty, the King of Bhutan. He has also received the Kalinga International Literary Award 2019. His latest books are The Great Hindu Civilization, Achievement, Neglect, Bias, and the Way Forward, which is the topic of our conversation today, and The Greatest Ode to Lord Ram, Tulsidas's Ramcharitamanas. Ambassador Verma, thank you very much once again for being with us today. And may I now start the conversation? Let me start with the title itself. Why Hindu? Why not Indian?
Well, because I believe, and thank you very much for your kind introduction. And let me begin by saying how happy and honored I am to be part of the Symbiosis Lit Fest, and how happy I am by my association with this great university. Since you have decided to ask me provocative questions, I must give straight replies. Because I believe that there is indeed something definable and verifiable called a Hindu civilization. While Hindus are included in the larger definition of Indian, there is no great necessity to conflate the two when you're speaking about a specific identity. So it's not either or, but I am focusing on the Hindu civilization to which this nation, this country, this civilization, and we, both Hindus and non Hindus, are in some way or the other heir to.
Well, Chinese sources tend to talk of early period of India's history as the great Buddhist kingdom, which seems to imply, and I know that you have said that Buddhism and Jainism are offshoots of Hinduism itself, but in the Chinese sources, they tend to talk of India as the great Buddhist kingdom. How then would you link this to your own idea of the Hindu civilization?
Because it's not only the Chinese. More recently, Dr. Amartya Sen has raised the question of why Hindu and why not Buddhist. After all, Buddhism was an important influence and movement in India for about a millennium. Because, again, I believe that while several religions and ways of thought have subsisted in India, there is a difference between the Hindu civilization and the Buddhist civilization, although I concede that there are many overlaps and commonalities. So I think, as you yourself said, that Buddhism itself was an offshoot from Hinduism. Some people consider it a protest movement. In my view, it was an offshoot from Hinduism, uh, much like Hinduism earlier even accommodated a great deal of diversity. For instance, the Charvaks, which is a materialist school of Hindu philosophy, articulated by the very intellectually insightful Brihaspati, said that the Vedas are lies. And he was a part of Hinduism, as was indeed the Charvak school, and similarly with other, the Tantric school was uh, uh, in its practices following esoteric rituals which were not part of mainstream Hinduism but was considered to be part of this great river of thought called Hinduism, in which tributaries flowed in and flowed out. But there was a definitive template called Hinduism, and Buddhism was, in my view, an offshoot of this template, a great religion in its own right, no doubt. And there were similarities between the two, but I don't think it would be appropriate to call the ancient period of our Indian history a Buddhist epoch alone. It was one of the many strands that were part of that period, but I think Hinduism was still a definable, separate, and dominant template, and therefore we must accept it for that reason.
Our early Sanskrit literature does not use the term Hindu at all. What we have is Sapta Sindhavaha, Dakshinapatha, and Tamilaha, where we have two which are geographical and one which is linguistic. So Tamilaham, particularly post 19th century, Tamil has always been seen as a distinct strand in itself, which takes off on different trajectories, including that of Shaivism and not so much the Pashupati, but as Bhikshakana. So there are aspects of Tamil Shaivism which go off in different directions, as also Kashmir Shaivism, which go off in different directions. These are all part of, very loosely, the trajectories of thought, yes, but they are also in many ways questioning of the kinds of trajectories that what you have said is Hindu thought. So how are these to be reconciled, or are they not to be reconciled at all?
No, in my view, I don't think the Hindus themselves, although they were increasingly from the beginning of their evolution united by a certain common vision, worldview, ritual practice, shastric framework, notion of divinity, their ideas of spirituality and metaphysics, their social structures. I believe that although all of this was in a process of evolution and could be identified very clearly, I don't think the Hindus self consciously call themselves as Hindus. But for the outsider observers, there were people who were bound within a certain united framework and could be identified as such. That is why Megasthenes in the 4th century BCE uh, could say that there are the Indus. That is why, for instance, many of the Chinese early treatises refer to the Indus, and some Arab sources have referred. So I think the Hindus themselves did not, Radhika ji, take on self-consciously the appellation of being Hindu, but I am looking from the point a hindsight of history and saying yes, they were a people who were Hindu by definition because of the reasons I mentioned: their worldview, their social structure, their ritualisms, their texts, their beliefs, their practices, and their cultural artifacts and beliefs. So I concede your point that the Hindus themselves have used different names for themselves, some of which are related to geography, Bharatvarsh, and so on and so forth, while others are about people. Also, I admit that within the larger Hindu framework, there were many local factors, and those factors were, in a sense, both different from and coterminous with the larger Hindu narrative. So there could be great deals of differentiations because Hinduism and Hindu civilization and culture has been very accommodative of diversity within its own fold. So, in my view, therefore, the fact that perhaps there was no, in earlier times, no such word as Hindu does not mean that there was no such thing as a Hindu civilization. Very often, movements like, for instance, in Islam, whether all of them in the early stages called themselves as Muslims, or whether in the early stages of Christianity they called themselves Catholic or Christians. It's debatable. In due course, their identity was more easily identified with a name, which is exactly what happened with Hindus as well.
But would you not argue that the construction of the Hindu framework was itself a British enterprise during colonialism, as well as a construction that came in through all the works on comparative philology in 19th century Europe? So then the framework is some that has been imposed on what they saw as Hinduism in the 19th and the 20th centuries.
See, one of the great myths is that British not only invented Hinduism but India as well. And the British like to take credit for this, that until they came, it was a disparate canvas of different faiths, beliefs, regions, loyalties, fiefdoms, kingdoms, and the British were the great uniting force. Here we must distinguish between a nation and a civilization. In my view, Indian civilization, which includes Hindu civilization, is millennia old. The nation state was actually born with the Treaty of Westphalia in the 17th century, with formal boundaries, a recognized territory, and a, a national state structure. Before that, there were civilizations which had enough in common within and in terms of their external worldview, but were not constituted as formal nation states. So I believe that the British may have discovered, as against created, discovered aspects of Hinduism, which is understandable because in the early phase of British colonization, you know about the Asia Society and about a great many of the Britishers being curious about the people they ruled and their culture and civilization. And therefore, there was a process of attempting to discover that afresh. And there was a reason to do so. Much had been lost. Much had been lost, interrupted, and in a sense, no longer organically flowing or as part of a uninterrupted evolution as a result of the Turkic invasion. I'll give you an example. Kautilya's Arthashastra was lost to posterity until one manuscript was discovered as late as the 19th century in Kerala. It was lost. And indeed, much was lost because there was a fair degree of destruction, including of the centers of learning. I need hardly point out to you that when Nalanda was destroyed by Bakhtiyar Khulji, the library itself burned for 18 months. Uh, it was so rich in treatises. So the British helped to rediscover abandoned monuments, temples, centers of learning, rediscovered for themselves languages, philology, Sanskrit. But that does not mean that, for instance, a Panini, the great grammarian, did not exist or that his work ceased to have relevance until the British discovered him. It does not mean that so many of the achievements of ancient India, which largely fall under the rubric of Hindu civilization, did not exist. They did, but they had been lost or temporarily were unrelated to in a living organic manner. And it was the British who helped as a part of the discovery. But from there, to take the quantum leap that some British scholars even today do, by saying that we discovered what Hinduism is I think fallacious.
Uh, P.J. Marshall has a book called The British Discovery of Hinduism in 18th Century India.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not at all surprised that P.G. Marshall wrote the book. It is the hubris of conquerors,
Mm.
of
I
colonizers.
would say that that is a rather more balanced book because he talked about the constraints of the 18th century, which made them rediscover Hinduism. The Portuguese tended not to use the word Hindu, they used the word Gentus. Until in Lisbon, it was pointed out to them that Gentoo meant the Jew and the Hindus were not Jews. It is then that they started using the word Jin. Otherwise, they tended to use the word Gentus and Banyas because those were the people they came. Gentus, Banyas, Nayars. That was the classification that they gave. The
As
Portuguese.
the British had.
British actually did not take this. The British said India. The British generally talked of India. Portuguese made this difference, and the
Well, a variation of colonizers.
variation of colonization. And this mentality definitely exists. But on the other hand, uh, would you agree, which again has been argued extensively, that the prioritization that has been given to Sanskrit has resulted in a a neglect or a dismissal at the worst of the kinds of developments that happened in Prakrit. I mean, you've got the Karpura Manjari in Prakrit, which is one of the most remarkable works on literary aesthetics, or of the entire corpus of Sangam literature, including the Tolkappiyam, which is a grammar book. And so there is a prioritization of Sanskrit and a conflation, therefore, of Sanskrit and Hindu.
You know, I don't really buy Sheldon Pollock's theory on Sanskrit, to be honest, because classical cultures over a period of time develop classical languages. Does Sheldon Pollock say that because of Latin, other languages were excluded?
No,
He doesn't.
he doesn't. He
He
talks
doesn't.
of Latin as the language of knowledge.
Knowledge. Well, Sanskrit was the language of knowledge, of high culture, of of a language that kept the record and continuity of knowledge. And it was one of the great achievements of Hindu India, a language remarkable both in its internal structure and for the corpus of knowledge that it managed to encompass. Uh, Now, did it lead to the, if not the prioritization of Sanskrit, to the marginalization of other languages? I am open on that question because all classical languages will tend at some point, because they are the language of the elite and of high culture, will tend to marginalize perhaps equally vibrant languages which are not part of that classical framework. However, I think much of it was rectified later during the Bhakti movement. Uh, a remarkable efflorescence of devotion, the democratization of Hinduism post the Turkic invasion. One of the reasons I believe Hinduism survived, where it moved from Sanskrit, the temple, the altar, the intermediary role of the priest, to the masses, but in their own languages. So Tukaram and Namdev wrote in Marathi, Chandidas, Vidyapati, Surdas, Govindas, Mirabai, Andal, Basavanna, Allama Prabhu, many Chaitanya, Andals and Nayanars before that, they wrote in their own language and remarkable poetry both in its literary verb and its content. So I think that there was a democratization of linguistics over a period of time, and it's quite remarkable that uh, India as a country had not one language but over 20 with their own vocabulary and corpus of literature over a period of time. So I think my view that because Hindu civilization developed a classical language which was the repository of its knowledge systems for a considerable period of time, is today looked upon as some kind of blemish on Hindu civilization for the prioritization it gave to Sanskrit. I think this is a biased.
Well, another debate is whether one can say bhakti is Hinduism at all. Is bhakti Hinduism? If it is, why and how?
But I'll tell you, it takes me back to Wendy Doniger, who said, "Dare I write Hinduism with a capital H?" And Hinduism, because she is mesmerized, even anxious about the great diversity it nurtures without losing its central narrative. She, used to the simplistic certitudes of Abrahamic faiths, says that Hinduism is a cross between a hedgehog and an armadillo, and therefore uh, is pilloried for its diversity, which it nurtures, and nurtures in a manner unlike the certitudes of an Abrahamic faith. Why should the Bhakti movement, for its simplifications of Hinduism, for its evolution of Hinduism away from a caste distinctions, not that they went away, caste distinctions, of its emphasis on devotionalism, of its emphasis on direct communion with God, of its emphasis on simple rituals like kirtans, of its mass nature, and its the ardor of its devotional poetry not be Hinduism. After all, even in classical Sanskrit, there is a no dearth of devotional literature. I mean, when you read Adi Shankaracharya's Bhaja Govinda, for instance, it's a pure and simple surrender to the Almighty. And I can quote many other examples. So I don't see why the Bhakti movement should be called not Hindu.
Jnaneshwari is a rendering of the Bhagavad Gita in Marathi and is a very difficult Marathi version of it because today one cannot really read and understand what Jnaneshwari is saying. But at the same time, Sanskrit tended as the language, as the classical language, tended to move away from the people to the courts. But within the texts themselves, Sanskrit makes a distinguish between Shastric and Shramanic. So would you say that Bhakti fits into the Shramanic section?
I don't think Bhakti fits into the Shastric category at least, because it was not a conscious collation in the nature of some of our Shastric inheritance. It was the spontaneous outpouring of devotional fervor. The gods were the same, but they became personalized. And in this sense, Sanskrit's purview and that of the purview of Hinduism carried in a more democratized manner through the language of the masses and multiple languages of the masses to homes and to hearths and to norm and to it's in enhancing its accessibility. I don't know. You're a historian. I'm not. I'm an interloper, Radhika ji. But I don't think it falls into Shastric literature if there is such a very
Shastric and
formal
Shramanic.
separation.
Shastric being the norm and Shramanic being the heterodox. At least that's the way it's been translated. Shramanic is not exactly heterodox. It is more, I think, questioning establishment.
Well, I think then Bhakti literature would fall in the Shramanic category more
Because
because it does question.
in the early texts, Buddhism, the Ajivikas, Charaka and The Ajivikas, the Jains, and the Buddhists, and Charaka were all classified as Shramanic. So questioning the Vedic structure. And the Shastrik was the Vedic structure. Okay. All of these become the ways in which they are defined. But in these categories, where would you put Kabir? Kabir, Rohidas, Guru Nanak, where would you place them?
I put Kabir and Guru Nanak, and I've argued that in my book, as definitive parts of the Bhakti movement. Sikhism became a separate religion. Kabir is a
Sorry, if I may
interrogative.
interrupt, I'll also give you another
Yes.
trajectory. Eknath's work, Hindu-Turk Samvad. And
must confess, I am not very familiar with Eknath's work to be able to comment on it. But definitely Kabir and his interrogatory Sufist poetry falls within the Bhakti movement and falls within that robust questioning of the establishment which Hinduism needed. And Guru Nanak, to my mind, I mean, Sikhism, uh, uh, although it is part of the Bhakti movement for its emphatic uh, uh, stress on surrender to the Almighty, uh, is actually pure Vedanta. The philosophy of the Advait school is carried, is put into a bhakti mold, reduced from its many rituals, if any, and becomes a credo of the followers, which of its followers. So I put them. I don't know, Radhikaji, whether you agree with me, but I put them squarely as part of bhakti literature.
let me take off on a slightly different track. And uh, you've talked of the Islamic conquest and of the violence of the conquest. No questioning on that part of it, because parts of the conquest were definitely violent. Thereafter, adjustments were made, a whole lot of them. And some of these, would you say that such adjustments could be understood in the sense of accommodation or assimilation, or what?
I don't know what you mean by adjustments, but what I do know is there are 2 points that I want to emphasize. We cannot airbrush history.
Sorry?
We cannot airbrush history.
No, we cannot. Definitely not.
There was an invasion. It was exceptionally violent. Will Durant says constitutes among the darkest chapters of history. There was pervasive destruction. Uh, there was definitely an element of proselytization, strongly so. There was a strong element of religious hostility. And there is no point trying to project a scenario where, from the hindsight of history, because you are motivated by a certain ideology, you almost make it out that the Turkic invaders arrived by a tourist bus. They were welcomed. They gave them some biryani. The others gave them some puri aloo. And a Ganga Jamuni Tehzeeb began to develop immediately. It didn't happen like that. What did happen is that India and something about the soil of this country over 600 years, 700 years, when two cultures grow and evolve together, there is in that interface at many levels of culture, of architecture, of language, of music, of poetry, of clothes, of sartorial aspects, and so on and so forth. There is a certain rubbing off, which is assimilative and which is enriching for both cultures. But let us not use an artificial measuring device. Let's not posit that because as a part of Muslim rule, the beautiful khayal form of singing in classical Indian music evolved. The destruction of Nalanda meant nothing. Now both happened. We need to take them on board. And today, one of the great imperatives is to not allow, after duly recognizing them, the acrimonies of the past to influence the imperatives of a modern, democratic, progressive, inclusive, and secular republic.
Where would you place Ibrahim Adil Shah in all of this? He called himself the son of Saraswati and Ganpati, and one
You
who
know, you are asking me micro questions of history on which I'm not very qualified, but you are the medieval historian. But I do believe that a great deal of syncretism took place, where the absolute black and white compartmentalization of cultures, of divisions, uh, most famously, for instance, Akbar marrying Jodhabai, or even later, Bahadur Shah Zafar going both to Bakhtiyar Kaki's mazar and visiting a temple on his Phulwalon ki Sair, or sitting on the ramparts of the Red Fort to watch the Ramlila procession while his chief physician was a Catholic. Now, these kind of things took place over a period of time between any two civilizations which evolved in the same geographical crucible and rub off in each other in enriching ways.
so going by the logic that they rub off on each other and the syncretism, and there is an enriching, then the entire uh, practice of the British of divide and rule and identifying rigid categories of Hindu and Muslim are in many ways responsible for acrimony, for highlighting one dimension of the past, and of forgetting the centuries of cohabiting and syncretic coming together in various ways. So, would you
Of
say
course,
colonialism is a result of colonial rule?
one one of the great classical instrumentalities of colonial rule is to divide and rule. And the British did that very successfully. It's not that there were no fault lines between the Hindus and Muslims in particular, in spite of the syncretism that had taken place. The British exploited them, in my view, built on them, reinforced them where it suited their imperial designs. But these fault lines existed as any fault lines would exist in a multicultural and plural society. But the British what became aware of them. They were afraid of Hindu Muslim unity as manifested itself, I think, in the 1857 revolt. And they sought to drive a wedge between the two communities subsequently.
I will take to a different aspect altogether. And this is entirely personal, Ambassador Verma. It's two things that I found totally missing in your work, from my perspective only. The first is the idea of technology and the uses and the ways in which technology developed in the Indian context. We have a phenomenal range of technology. Why is it that you have not mentioned this technological interface anywhere in your work? Because that, I think, is part of our civilizational development.
Perhaps I could have mentioned it in greater detail.
Mm.
I've spoken about the great achievements in science. I've also mentioned about the great achievements at the technological level in the area of metals and minerals, health, in investigation, in research. The point, Dr. Session, is when you write a book, and you've written many yourself, you can always be asked why you haven't mentioned something. Either it's egregiously a loss, In other words, you've missed out something very obvious. And in that case, I plead guilty. Or I could perhaps have dwelt on it a little more. As it is, my book is over 400 pages. I carry with me a central thesis and deal with the big events from my point of view. I'm not writing the book from your point of view. I'm writing it from
Exactly.
my point. And
Which is why I said it's entirely personal.
and I have an argument to make and develop, which is what any author seeks to do in his book. So perhaps I could have dwelt on these details in greater length. There was also the constraint of time. There was also the constraint of size. There was also that I may lose the wood for the trees. Very often you have to make a choice and sift facts in the if you want to establish a central argument in a book.
No argument about that part of it. But I found that when you talked so much about painting and aesthetics, why didn't you bring cloth? For me, that's one of the crucial dimensions of India.
So I mentioned textiles, but I could write if you will sponsor me a book on textiles, which is a separate book.
Which
But
is,
I will
I know.
indeed, indeed it is, and I have some familiarity with the subject. But here I was writing a book on the generic framework of a civilization, of which there are many parts and elements. And I had to make a choice among how much I dwell on only one part and how much that may take away from the central argument I'm making. But I concede your point.
Textiles brings me to another point, which is India's engagement with the maritime world. That, I mean, Sanskrit sources talk of Sagara and Samudra. And that's a very blanket. And the Rig Veda talks
I
about
think I have
maritime
mentioned
world.
how I think I have mentioned about how at a certain point of time, especially in the early centuries of the 19th century, not the 19th century, the millennium, what is it called, CE. There was until the 11th century CE a great expansion of India's cultural footprint, largely through maritime trade in Southeast Asia. I've given examples of this all over Southeast Asia. Again, having mentioned this, I have probably not gone into greater detail because my essential point was that when a culture is internally vibrant, the possibilities of its expansion become manifold. In other words, that is how I see the expansion of India's cultural footprint from the coastal areas, uh, led by powerful kings, especially in the south, into Southeast Asia.
I would go into the last, very last question, I promise, which is your last chapter about the problems facing India, the challenge of the modern republic. You have identified, I have the book right here, and you have identified some 8 imperatives that you think are required for a modern republic to continue. And these 8 imperatives, do you think that they can be met? That they ought to be met? I agree with you totally. But how do we meet them? Maybe that's a bit.
Now, what are since you have read my book more closely than I have written it, what are the 8 imperatives? I have talked about the challenges. Have I listed 8?
I think you've listed in sequence, listed about 8 of them. Well, you have you've talked about Hindu revivalism, the Hindu Rashtra, reinvent Hinduism, resentment against, and you've talked about Savarkar and his Vedoktabandi. And then you've talked about oppressive disunity. Those,
Okay, let me reduce these eight to two broad imperatives that I believe are necessary for Hindu civilization and Hinduism today, including the challenge that is being posed to mainstream sanity of Hinduism by ultra right and distorted interpretations of Hinduism, largely in the hands of lumpen elements, which are being encouraged by the state. Having said that, the two things I emphasize upon is first is knowledge. I think Hindus themselves, even though Hinduism is not a prescriptive faith where you have to pray in a certain way, go to a certain temple, read a certain book, pay obeisance to a certain pope. It is not one of those religions, it's more a way of life. Yet I believe that Hindus themselves would do would be better able to counter the distortions of Hinduism and also enrich themselves about the grandeur of their own legacy in many areas, not only spirituality and metaphysics, if they know a little more about him. The second imperative in my mind is social reform within Hinduism. Firstly, on the caste issue, where I still believe that there is a great deal of inequality and oppression in the name of caste within Hindu society, for which we need not only laws but a change in mindset. And I argue that all those who spoke of Hinduism, including Savarkar, but Swami Vivekananda, Mahatma Gandhi, Jyotibai Phule, there is a whole panoply of great statesmen and scholars and uh, writers who have talked about the imperative of this social reform, caste and gender disparity. I think Hinduism needs to look inwards as we move towards a new renaissance.
Ambassador Verma. One question from Lalita Padgaonkar. Can you please explain pure
Tell Lalita that I can't answer this on this program. What is, I saw that. She's asked me on the phone as well. What is undifferentiated? What is the ultimate reality and what is pure consciousness? Uh, it's not really a subject of this discussion. It's much more related to my book on Adi Shankaracharya. And therefore, I think it's only fair that we have a bilateral discussion on this, which I will speak to her about.
gender disparities, as you just said, Ambassador Verma, are a major problem. And it is an unfortunate reality that something that Catherine Mayo said
Yes,
time ago.
gender disparity and caste.
Yes, that there continues to be this gap between the so-called textual construction of women and the social reality of the position of women in particular. But I would actually widen that to say that it isn't just women, it is also the ways in which young boys are constructed. So not women, but gender.
May I make a suggestion, Radhika?
Yes.
Since it's almost 11:54 and Dr. Pawan is joining in, would you, like to, Latika ji posted a question and then I think Dr. Vaidya's posted something. Would you like to maybe open up to comments or would you like to offer some comments?
Well, with Lalita's no, that's total philosophy, and that's not something that I have ever really looked at. So I think somebody like Nikhil would be better equipped to answer that.
Okay.
I agree totally with what Vaidya said. There is a conflation very often between religion, civilization, and the political nation. And in the 21st century, the idea of religion defining the nation has become much more of an important aspect worldwide. So the nation state is now, unfortunately, I would say, very often conflated with a very, very jingoistic assertion of a particular form of religion. And therefore, I would argue, I think I would classify myself as an 18th century liberal. And therefore, I would argue that the nation state itself is in peril because of the problems that we are facing because of this kind of conflation. Civilization is more than religion. The nation is more than religion. But when you reduce both these to just the religion, you are negating civilization, nation, and culture. That would be my take on it.
Right. So I think Ambassador Verma is not being able to join us due to connectivity issues. So we conclude our very, very provocative conversational session here today. Thank you very much, Dr. Session, for doing this and for carrying forward this conversation. And we'll take a break for 15 minutes and come back for a session on music. So as they say, stay tuned and we'll see you at 12:15.
Yes. Thank you very much and bye.